Hey everybody, Will Hamilton here, and welcome to the second free video in our four-part training series. First, I want to thank everybody who left comments on the first video. And before we get to today's lesson, we're going to do a quick bag check. You may recognize this location. This is where Tennis Channel does most of their bag checks. Well, at FYB we actually have a bags check because we have a ton of gear here. You'll see that we have this enormous camera in the background. We got another camera over there. Well, this camera breaks down and goes into all these boxes here. This big case right here is the tripod case for this big tripod there. And then this camera here, which is called a Red 1, breaks down and gets put in all these various boxes. These are two other tripod bags. And over here we've got basically a bag full of all sorts of audio equipment. I have to untangle this later. That's not going to be very fun. But we thought that'd be a cool little look inside of our operation. And now what we're going to go do is we're actually going to head out on court and we're going to get Adam Szyminski, the tech genius behind FYB. The reason all the video looks good is because of Adam. So we're going to get Adam walking us through how this Red 1 works. That's going to be very cool. So with that in mind, let's head out to that segment. All right, so we've got the camera put together and we are out filming Rafael Nadal. And what we're going to do is actually come over here and see Adam in action operating this camera, because this thing is pretty monstrous. I don't know how it works. It's got a lot of buttons, so I'm just going to kick it over to Adam. Why don't we bring the camera over here so you can see it from this vantage point with Rafa in the background, and Adam, take it away.
So this camera is called a Red 1. It's actually not technically a video camera. It's a digital cinema camera. This is actually designed to shoot feature film movies on a camera like this, something like The Social Network. If you saw that, earlier this year, that was filmed on this. The Book of Eli. A lot of big budget Hollywood movies now are being shot on this camera. It's a pretty crazy rig. Different from a video camera in that if I want to zoom, we have this whole gear system here that will move the lens, and this is actually a film lens, not a video lens, so it's entirely manual. If you want to focus it, you actually have to rack the focus by hand, which is what this wheel comes in handy for. So sometimes as Rafa will move from one side of the court to the other and he'll come closer or further away, I actually have to change the focus of the camera by racking this wheel back and forth. So crazy contraption. This thing probably weighs like 150 pounds, takes two people to move around. That's what we have Sam here for. Awesome guy helping us out. Friend of ours since from middle school. And it shoots to a hard drive, and this thing will shoot like a terabyte of footage a day. So most people's home computers might have like a couple hundred gigabytes. This thing shoots a terabyte a day. So we have to bring a lot of storage with us when we come out here to Indian Wells so that we can keep all that footage that we shoot.
I don't know about y'all, but I didn't understand anything Adam just said. My brain's kind of hurting now. So with that in mind, we just wanted to quickly show you this thing in action because it's a pretty awesome piece of equipment. And you've seen some of this footage before because we used this camera to film at Indian Wells last year. But with that in mind, that ends the technical segment of this video. Let's get back to the instruction. All right, so one quick preface before we head back to the studio. Today's lesson is on DNO. And you're going to love DNO because we're going to teach you some of the strategies and tactics the pros are using and how you can apply the same strategies and tactics to your game. Now make sure you watch the previous video where we talk about directionals, court positioning, court geometry, and SWAT, because you have to understand that stuff to understand DNO. So with that in mind, let's head back to the studio and get on with today's lesson. So DNO stands for Defense Neutral Offense, and there's two key concepts you need to take away from DNO. First, it's to understand that you can be in one of these three states during a point. You can be on defense, you can be in a neutral rally, or you can be on offense. And we're going to specifically define how you know what state you're in a second. So in other words, DNO allows you to identify with a specific set of criteria what state you are in. Now second, you can think of DNO as a big toolbox of tactics you can use to transition from defense to neutral and neutral to offense. Now the other key concept here is this is not just some big toolbox and you kind of rummage around and pull out stuff at random. The tactics housed within DNO are specifically designed to transition from defense to neutral or neutral to offense. So in other words, you are going to know, well, I'm in a neutral rally right now, and this is the dynamic of the match. Given my SWOT analysis, this is the tool I need. So it allows you to identify the specific tactics you want to use based on, again, whether you're in a defensive situation, a neutral rally, or on offense, and more broadly, the dynamics of the match given the matchup, again, given that SWOT analysis that we've already done. So those are the two key things you need to understand as we move forward with this concept. Now, I alluded to this just a second ago, the progression here for DNO. You always want to go from defense to neutral and neutral to offense. Obviously, don't want to go in reverse. And also, I've got this blue line, no, over to offense. That means you don't want to try to jump from defense straight to offense, because that jump is going to be a low percentage play. It basically means you're in a defensive situation and you try and rip a winner. It's not going to happen very often. So you first want to neutralize the rally and then work your way up to offense. So there's a very specific progression, again, you're trying to work through. So there's two criteria we're going to use to define whether you're on defense, in a neutral rally, or on offense. The first one is the quality of shot making. And that's pretty easy to figure out. That's just the quality of your ball, the ball you're hitting, relative to the quality of the ball your opponent is hitting. So, for example, if you get into a forehand to forehand exchange, we're going to put you down here. Remember, circle's the player, stick is the side you're hitting on. This is a forehand for a righty. And we got your opponent up here, so forehand to forehand exchange. If your forehand is better than your opponent's forehand, you are now on offense, your opponent is on defense. If your forehands are equal, then it's a neutral rally. And if your forehand isn't as good as your opponent's, if your opponent has a better forehand than you, then you are on defense, your opponent is on offense. Now keep in mind that this analysis needs to apply to all the shots, it needs to apply to the entire matchup. This is back to SWOT. So we use SWOT to define defense, neutral, or offense. You could be in a defensive rally on a forehand-to-forehand exchange, but you could be on offense, backhand-to-backhand. And again, that's really important to understand because, it might make sense for you to go backhand-to-backhand with your opponent, even if that's not your favorite exchange. Again, this is where we're starting to think about the other end of the court, and when you do that, you realize, well, my forehand might be my favorite shot, but based on this matchup, it's actually a defensive situation for me. But my backhand, I typically don't hit it that, I don't like to hit it frequently, but it actually puts me in the driver's seat. It puts me on offense, just given this quality of shot making matchup. So again, really important to understand, and again, that first criteria we use to define whether you're on defense, neutral, or offense. So our second criterion is court positioning. And that simply means where you're positioned versus, relative to your opponent. And we already know what proper positioning is from one of the previous videos. So let's say we've got a backhand to backhand exchange between you down here again and Villain up here. This would be a neutral rally from a court positioning standpoint because both of y'all are positioned correctly given the cross-court exchange that's going on here. Now, what happens if we move you way out here, but your opponent stays there? Now your opponent is on offense because your court positioning isn't any good. And of course, the reverse would be true if you are here and your opponent is, wherever, way off the court. Now you are in the driver's seat, you are on offense because your opponent's court positioning isn't any good. Also, important to understand, this doesn't just apply to lateral court positioning. It also applies to vertical court positioning. If you are positioned here and your opponent is way back in the stands, then you are going to be on offense because your opponent has way more court to cover standing that far back. So there's also a vertical component. It's both horizontal and vertical that determines the court positioning battle and whether you are on defense, neutral, or offense from that court positioning lens. So we've talked about these two criteria from a theoretical standpoint. Well, let's now pivot and look at some real-world examples from the Pro Tour to see how this all applies. And we're also going to talk through some of the tactics. We're going to talk about some of the tactics in that toolbox you guys can apply to your games. So the first thing we're going to do is look at the Roger Federer, Rafael Nadal matchup, and we're going to look at it through the lens of quality of shot making. And this one's real easy, right? You've got Rafa's lefty forehand going to Federer's righty backhand. Everybody out there who's watched any pro tennis knows that this is clearly an offensive situation for Nadal, clearly defensive for Federer. This is what has allowed Rafa to beat Federer basically every single time on clay, and certainly get the best of Fed on other surfaces very frequently. So again, this is just, Federer, simply put, to boil it down to the most obvious, or the base level, is Nadal's forehand is better than Federer's backhand. That's sort of all you have to take away from it. But the interesting thing is that because of that, because it's just such a clear advantage for Rafa, his strategy often is just to get into these cross-court exchanges. So the tactic you should take away is, well, if I have a clearly better shot, I should just go my strength to my opponent's weakness if you can set up an exchange like that. It sometimes doesn't have to be more complicated than that. Rafa's strategy is very obvious. Everybody on the Pro Tour, particularly all the righties out there, know what Rafa's going to do. He's going to set up an exchange like this, and he's going to win most of the points. So you don't always, the tactic doesn't have to be, crazy disguise. It can be pretty straightforward if it's a clear offense to defense situation in your favor. So that would be the first example of quality, or that'd be an example of quality of a shot making, how that affects DNO. You can obviously think of many other matchups, both on the Pro Tour and I'm sure your experiences as tennis players as well. Now let's talk about DNO and court positioning, and the real world example we're going to use is Andre Agassi. I've actually termed the tactic we're going to talk about the Agassi method, because this was really Agassi's bread and butter. And what Agassi would do is yo-yo his opponent from side to side. Agassi liked to control the middle of the court, and any shots in this area, he would go corner to corner to move his opponent from side to side. Now, what Agassi was really looking to do, and let's take a quick step back. If we're talking about a cross-court exchange here, backhand to backhand, this would be the recovery point that his opponent would want to get to. And if we're talking forehand to forehand, then we have this recovery point over there. So Agassi did two things. He went side to side to try and prevent his opponent from getting to the correct recovery points by the time he made contact. So in other words, if Agassi's right here and his opponent is hitting a ball there back cross court, Agassi was trying to make contact before his opponent could get there. And if that happens, well, his opponent's a little bit out of position, right? So because his opponent's not positioned properly, then Agassi, in this instance, is at a slight advantage from a court positioning standpoint. Now, Agassi, knowing that, would take, whether this was a backhand or a forehand, he would put that ball over here. So his opponent would run over there, hit that ball, send it back cross court to Agassi, who has now recovered to the correct point. But maybe this time, his opponent's only here by the time Agassi makes contact. So whether Agassi gets a forehand or a backhand, that ball goes over here. So now his opponent has even more distance to cover, and you can see over the series of several shots, his opponent gets further and further out of position to the point where his opponent could basically be in the boonies by the time Agassi is making contact, and Agassi just has to put the ball in the open court. Doesn't have to do too much, hit in terms of the quality of the shot. Can just put the ball over there. He's going to, if not hit a winner, his opponent is going to have a tough time getting to that. Maybe Agassi could close and put that ball away. But what's important to note here from the Agassi method standpoint is we're not just talking about, this is effective from court positioning standpoint, not just for the lateral component, but also the vertical component. Because Agassi really just stood right up on the baseline to take time away. If Agassi was using the same tactic, but he stood really far behind the baseline, let's say we get this initial cross-court rally, his opponent has to hit a ball here, but Agassi standing further behind the baseline, ball has to travel farther, his opponent has more time to recover. So his opponent might get to the correct recovery position in this point. And even if Agassi goes over here, then his opponent's going to have time to get to the ball. Agassi, in the meantime, would recover over there, still far behind the baseline. So by the time the ball gets to Agassi over here, his opponent might be on the correct positioning point. So this particular technique, tactic, the Agassi method, ideally requires that you stand up on the baseline because you're trying to take time away from your opponent, because by taking time away, you get them further and further from the correct recovery points until they're just completely out of position, and you just put the ball into the open court, and you win that point. The final thing I would highlight in terms of this method, who on the Pro Tour right now uses this tactic really well? We'll do a quiz. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. It's Davydenko. He's kind of the current day example of a player using this tactic. Now, up to this point, we've talked about shot making, we've talked about court positioning and sort of their own little segments. But as you obviously know, these two things are working together during a match, during any given point. So let's come back to illustrate exactly how this works. Let's come back to Nadal and Federer. I'll put Rafa down here. We're going to go back to our forehand to backhand exchange. And, you know, there's the component of Rafa's forehand getting high in Federer's strike zone. Federer struggles with that. He's just going to lose points from purely the shot-making standpoint. But Rafa also is great at angling his forehand. He's got so much topspin, he can really pull Fed off the court. So Fed's at sort of a double disadvantage in this instance. You have a quality of shot-making advantage for Rafa, and Rafa can get Fed out of position, leaving a ton of open court for him to hit into. So this is really, you know, again, if you've got the Federer-Rafa matchups in the past DVR'd somewhere, go watch how Rafa does this. Maybe go to YouTube, but watch how Rafa uses that forehand not only to break down Federer's backhand, maybe give him some short balls where he can really attack, but also just pull him off the court so that he is in a much more advantageous position from the court positioning standpoint. So again, there's, you know, a very, I think, obvious example, an example most of y'all are going to understand and intuitively know from the Pro Tour. Now, also key to understand that DNO, you can start on defense, you can start in a neutral position, or you could start on offense. So let's talk about exactly how that would work. And sticking with the Pro Tour, we'll put some unnamed pro down here, and we're going to put Andy Roddick up here. So Roddick, obviously, massive serve. So he's going to be in the driver's seat from a quality of shot-making standpoint. He's just bombing, you know, 135-mile-an-hour serves there. It's tough to return those. He's also at an advantage from a court positioning standpoint, because when you return, you basically start on the single sideline, but the server is much closer to the middle of the court. Somewhere here is going to be the correct positioning point for somebody hitting on this end of the court. So Roddick is at, or any server is at a double advantage. You're serving, quality of shot making, and you've got your opponent starting out of position, so out of position relative to you. So that is why, you know, at the Pro Tour, the serving is such a big advantage, and why people rarely get broken, is you've got both criteria, shot making and court positioning, working in your favor. Now, just at the rec level, if you miss that first serve and then you get a second serve, then maybe it's more of a neutral situation. I mean, it really depends on how good your opponent's serve can be. If you've got a great return and your opponent has a mediocre serve, you might actually be on offense if you could really get a hold of it. And we come back to the Pro Tour, you look at a guy like Agassi. There was a guy who was a master of turning particularly second serves into offensive opportunities for him. He had a great return, awesome hand-eye coordination. So Agassi actually was sometimes on offense returning, which is pretty rare. So again, the broad concept here is, in any given point, you can start on defense, you can start on neutral, and you can start on offense, and it's going to depend on some of the stuff we just talked about. All right, so it's the moment maybe many of you have been waiting for, the how to beat a pusher strategy. Now, we're going to first start by defining a pusher. We're going to use SWOT to define a pusher because there's a number of definitions out there. And the way I define a pusher is, first of all, someone who does not have correct technique. They literally push the ball back into the middle of the court. And again, that's key. Middle of the court, lacking correct technique. Their ability to control direction is not going to be very good. So most of the balls are going to be somewhere in here in the middle of the court. The corners are basically out of the equation because their technique, a pusher's technique, just doesn't allow them to be very precise. They win by keeping the ball in and frustrating you and forcing you into errors. Other important point from a court positioning standpoint, while a pusher is typically a good mover, they stand very far behind the baseline so that they have time to run down a lot of balls. So with that in mind, let's see how we can use DNO to construct a DNO and everything else we've been talking about to construct a winning strategy. Now, you'll see these X's up here, and these are court positioning points you would typically use if you're just in a standard rally. So this was what it would be for cross-court backhand to backhand. This was where it would be for forehand to forehand. We're actually going to, who knows if the pusher even recovers correctly. My guess is that most pushers go back to the middle of the court. But we're actually not going to put you here. The first thing we're going to do is get you in a cross-court backhand to backhand rally with the pusher. And you would typically recover here. We're not going to do that. We're going to put you on court positioning point. We're just put you on the 1. So this is where you're going to be positioning yourself when you're playing a pusher. Now you might say to yourself, well, I'm leaving a lot of this part of the court exposed. You're giving this away actually, and you're not really leaving it exposed because, again, pusher lacking that technique, not going to be able to hit too many balls very precisely over there. If they get 1 or 2, fine, whatever. But pusher, most of those balls have a lot of air under them. You're not going to have too much trouble covering this stuff. So I would just give it away. And again, cross-court rally like this, outside ground stroke, and we know those are harder to control, very unlikely for someone with limited technique. So you actually want to cheat over, because then what happens, and what you're looking for, is you're going to stay in a rally like this, cross-court, backhand to backhand, and one other assumption we're making here is that your forehand's your favorite shot. We're going to wait because we know the pusher doesn't have the best control. We're going to wait for a ball in the middle of the court that allows us to get inside the baseline. And by standing over here, that puts a lot of balls on our forehand side, but importantly, because we're in a cross-court rally, backhand to backhand, these are going to be inside ground strokes. So from a quality of shot making standpoint, because you have an inside ground stroke, easier to control, you can do more with that ball. So that's the ideal pitch down the plate, so to speak. That's the one you're waiting for. Now, when you get that ball, you are going to change direction and go into the open court. And what you're looking for is, because the pusher's so far behind the baseline, they are going to be running, and ideally you want them to hit the ball on the run where they're not set up. And because the pusher has limited technique again, you're not going to be too worried about this stunningly good passing shot. So you're going to progress from 2 to 3, and the pusher most likely, again, not too much topspin in there, ball's going to be high over the net. On a passing shot, that subsequent shot just goes to the open court and probably going to go for a winner. Now, the one thing most of you the pusher is your nemesis, you already know that a lot of these balls are going to come back as lobs. So what you want to make sure you don't do is come all the way up to net. You basically want to be a step or so inside the service line, and you want to see what's coming. If it's a lob, let's say you're not great at taking them out of the air, then for any lob that lands, we'll say in this general region here, in there, you'll have time to back up. You can just let it bounce, and then you can just step in and put it into the open court. And you don't, let me be very clear here, you don't have to do anything too fancy. You can just put it over there. Even if the pusher is back to the middle of the court, you're going to be in the driver's seat here. Just make sure you don't overhit. So that would be how you handle that lob. And really the way the pusher in this instance is going to neutralize is by hitting a really good lob. And on the run, not going to happen too often. We're actually going to talk about how you can adjust if that happens in the next video. But let's quickly review this one more time and talk through the DNO implications to make this real clear. So you're at point one, cross court, outside ground strokes. Pusher's not going to go down the line. You wait for a short ball, inside ground stroke. That's sort of a benefit from a quality of shot making standpoint. And you are now at a court positioning advantage as well because you're inside the baseline. Pusher is far behind the baseline. And also, if you go to the open court, if you can catch him before he gets back to the correct recovery point, he's going to be on the run. He's probably going to be on the run regardless. And then you come in here. Certainly, court positioning is at your advantage. You're inside the court, and the pusher is going to have to come up with a really good shot here. You're going to have to come up with a really, really good shot. This is a clear example if we come back to the general principle we talked about, where we're talking about DNO and this transition. Really the best, and this is key to understand for y'all, really the best the pusher can do here is transition from defense to neutral. If he tries and uncork a winner and do this, he's probably going to make an error. Most players, just generally, are going to make an error. So you are very much on offense in this situation. So the key is to recognize that and not try and do anything too fancy. Just simply playing, hitting quality shots, you're going to be just fine. The onus is on the pusher because he is on defense. So he has to come up with a good shot to neutralize. Probably not going to happen too often. Put the ball in the open court. Use all this stuff we've been talking about to your advantage, and you are going to be winning most of these points, and the pusher not going to be a big problem anymore. Back at Indian Wells, now you know what DNO is. Now you have that tactic for beating a pusher. And speaking of pushers, let me point out someone who is most definitely not a pusher, Maria Sharapova right over there, one of the biggest hitters on the women's tour. So in the next video, what we're going to do is talk about how the pros think a little bit differently than everybody else, because it's one thing to understand DNO and have that toolbox of tactics, but how do you actually apply that stuff, and how do you make adjustments based on the ebb and the flow of the match? That's one of those tactics or one of those abilities rather, that really sets the pros apart from everybody else, because the match doesn't always play out like you plan, and when you're in a situation like that, you better adjust or you're going to lose the match. So that's what we're going to see in the next video. Now, in closing with this video, please let me know, first of all, what you think of DNO in the comments below, and what your specific favorite tactic is, because everybody has at least one favorite tactic, whether it's I'm going to play to my forehand and hit a lot of those, or I'm going to try and run my opponent around, hit to the open court, and so on. So let me know what you think of DNO and what your favorite tactic is. I will be reading those comments, looking forward to that, and I will be jumping in and answering any questions you might have. So with that, I'm going to sign off, but I will see you in the next video.